Late in December, in the year 1299, the night sky over Delhi didn't feel like sky at all. It felt like a ceiling, low, heavy, and dirty with smoke. If you stood on the walls, you could taste it on your tongue. Ash and cold air. Fear, if fear has a flavor. I'm Steve Turcott, and I want to take you up there with the sentries for a moment. Not to the comfort of the palace, not to the safety of a prayer whispered behind a door. Up to the stone ramparts where men in armor stare into the dark and try not to let their hands shake on the wood of their spears. Because what they see beyond the northern walls is not a single camp and not a normal army. It's a horizon of fire. At first, it's just a few orange points in the distance, like stars that have dropped out of the heavens. Then your eyes adjust and the dots multiply. 1 becomes 10. 10 becomes 100, and soon the plain looks like it's been sown with embers from one end of the world to the other. Campfires. Thousands of them. An army has arrived that people have been naming in their nightmares for generations. The Mongols. Even saying the word changes the air in a room. It's not just a name, it's a warning. In many places, it had become a kind of verdict: surrender or be erased. Cities that resisted sometimes vanished so completely that later travelers argued over where they had even stood. The Mongols carried more than bows and horses. They carried a reputation that could collapse a kingdom before the first arrow flew. Inside Delhi, the fear doesn't stay politely outside. It spreads through streets and courtyards and markets like smoke. Refugees push in from the north with whatever they can carry: a blanket, a pot, a child on the hip. Their stories are always the same shape, even when the details change. Fast riders, sudden violence, and the sense that the world you lived in yesterday can be taken away in one afternoon. And in the middle of all that, there are still ordinary moments. That's what always gets me. History books can make a crisis feel clean, like it's made of dates and banners. But a city under threat is not clean. Somewhere below those walls, a mother pulls her son close. He's small enough that her arm can wrap around him like a shield. He points up toward the distant glow with the simple curiosity of a child who hasn't learned what men can do to each other. "Who are they?" he asks. And she can't answer him, not because she doesn't know, because she does know. Everyone knows. Her throat closes around the truth, and she does what parents have done in every century. She tries to keep the terror out of her voice, even when she can't keep it out of her heart. Up on the ramparts, the sentries keep watching. Torchlight flickers on wet stone. Helmets gleam dully. Breath hangs in the air in pale clouds. A few men cross themselves. Others stare without blinking, as if they can hold the line with their eyes alone. And I want you to imagine what it feels like to be one of them. You're not reading a chronicle, you're not looking at a painted map, you're standing on a wall with cold creeping into your boots, and you're watching an ocean of enemy fire. The distance is close enough to feel insulting, close enough that you can't pretend it's someone else's problem. Just beyond those flames are horses, thousands of them. You don't see them all at once, but you hear them: the occasional snort, the clink of tack, the low murmur of men moving through camp. It's not loud. That's part of what makes it worse. It's the quiet confidence of an army that believes it belongs there. In moments like this, people tell themselves stories to survive the waiting. Some whisper prayers, some bargain with God, some convince themselves the walls are stronger than fear, stronger than hunger, stronger than siege. But others remember what happened elsewhere. They remember the reports that came west and south over the years, carried by merchants, fugitives, envoys who survived only because they arrived after the worst was finished. Tales of cities that opened their gates and lived, and cities that didn't and died screaming. This is what reputation does. It turns the imagination into a weapon. The Mongols were masters of that, not because they were supernatural. They were human, highly trained, brutally organized, and often merciless, but still human. They got hungry, they got sick, they bled, and yet their name could still paralyze a city. And that is exactly what Delhi is fighting tonight, even before it fights on a battlefield. It's fighting panic. It's fighting the temptation to believe resistance is pointless. Inside the city, you can feel that struggle in the small details. Shops closing early, people hoarding grain, soldiers writing quick notes to families who might not see them again, priests and imams and holy men of every kind speaking into crowded rooms, trying to keep a lid on chaos by offering meaning. If you've ever been in a place where everyone is waiting for bad news, you know the sound of it. The city doesn't roar, it murmurs, it whispers, it holds its breath. And somewhere, behind stone and protocol, behind advisors and guards, a ruler is being forced into the oldest question of leadership. What do you do when the enemy is at your door? A city can hide behind its walls. Sometimes that's wisdom, sometimes it's cowardice. It depends on the moment, and on what the rest of your realm will believe afterward. Because this isn't only about military reality, it's about political reality. In a kingdom held together by power and fear and loyalty, the perception of weakness can be fatal. Alauddin Khalji is not a simple character to place in a moral frame. He was capable of great cruelty. He ruled with suspicion. He enforced discipline harshly because he believed discipline was the thin line between order and collapse. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A harsh ruler can still be the man standing between a city and disaster. History loves pure heroes and pure villains. Real life rarely gives us that. On this night, he has to decide what the city will do next. Whether Delhi will try to negotiate, whether it will wait and hope the enemy moves on, whether it'll gamble everything on a fight outside the walls. And I'm not going to rush past that decision, because it's easy for us, safe in the distance of centuries, to say what we think a leader should do. It's different when you're the one who has to live with the consequences. Different when your mistake means not a bad chapter in a book, but fires in your streets. So I want you to sit with the uncertainty for a moment. Imagine being a soldier who doesn't know the plan yet. You only know the Mongols are out there. Imagine being a merchant staring at empty shelves. Imagine being that mother, trying to answer a child's question with silence because the truth feels too sharp to speak aloud. This is also where ideas like honor start to change shape. We talk about honor like it's a shining thing, clean, simple, heroic. But in a city like this, honor can mean holding your post while your stomach turns. It can mean not running when your mind screams at you to run. It can mean obeying orders you don't fully understand because the alternative is chaos. And sometimes, honor is just the refusal to pretend. The fires burn through the night. The smoke hangs over Delhi like a prophecy. The sentries keep their eyes on the plain, because if the Mongols move, someone has to see it first. Somewhere below, the city's prayers continue, not loud enough to drown fear, but steady enough to resist it. If you're listening to this, I want you to picture that final hour before dawn. The cold is deepest then. The sky is at its darkest just before it turns. And that's when the mind runs wild. When you imagine footsteps outside your door that aren't there. When you mistake fog for movement. When every sound feels like the beginning. Morning is coming. And with it, the moment when waiting ends and choices become irreversible. Stay with me, because next we step off the walls and into the decisions that will shape what happens on the plain beyond Delhi. If you want to understand why those fires appeared outside Delhi in the winter of 1299, you have to zoom out, far beyond the city walls, and then slowly come back in. Picture the world north of India in the late 13th century. Long grasslands, bitter mountain passes, and trade routes that tied together places that barely understood each other. That northern world had been reshaped almost within living memory by Mongol conquest. But by the time we reach this story, the Mongol Empire isn't a single unified fist anymore. It's fractured. After the great expansion of the early Mongol period, power splintered into rival branches, descendants and successors who shared a lineage but did not always share a purpose. Medieval sources describe this as separate khanates, and in practice, that's what they became. The Yuan realm in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Golden Horde to the northwest, and the Chagatai Khanate across Central Asia. That division matters because it creates a strange kind of pressure. When the Mongols were one empire, expansion could flow outward in multiple directions. But once they became several competing states, expansion became political survival. A Khan couldn't simply sit still, not for long. Victories kept alliances intact, raids brought in wealth, wealth paid soldiers, and soldiers, especially mounted soldiers, were not cheap to maintain, even for a steppe power that lived close to the horse. Now, think like a ruler of the Chagatai Khanate for a moment. Look at the map with me. the way a medieval commander would, not as borders on paper, but as realities that can kill you. To the west and northwest, other Mongol powers. To the east, other Mongol powers. If you attack them, you risk starting a civil war inside the Mongol world, one that might bleed you dry and hand your rivals an opening. So where do you go? South begins to look less like a choice and more like the only available direction. And south, for the Chagatai leadership, meant the frontier of the Delhi Sultanate. By the late 1200s, the Chagatai realm was associated in many sources with a ruler named Dua, often called Dua Khan in later retellings. The names and spellings shift from chronicle to chronicle, but the pattern is consistent. There were repeated Mongol incursions toward India in the 1290s. Some were raids, some were probing attacks, tests of speed, defenses, and response times. And here's something that's easy to miss if you only think in terms of battles. These were not just military events, they were information-gathering missions. A steppe army succeeds when it knows where to ride, what to avoid, who will fold, and who will fight. Those early clashes also set the emotional temperature, because when people say the Mongols are coming, they don't mean a normal war. They mean the arrival of a force that in many parts of Eurasia had become synonymous with catastrophe. But in this moment, there's another layer. The Chagatai leadership wasn't only thinking about loot. They were thinking about prestige, about legitimacy, about proving strength in a world where Mongol rulers competed with Mongol rulers. And that brings us to one of the most telling details in the tradition, the commander. Many accounts connect the major push toward Delhi with Dua's son, Kutlug Khwaja and other spellings. The names and spellings shift from chronicle to chronicle, but the pattern is consistent. The fact that a prince is associated with the campaign is significant. That's not how you treat a casual raid. That signals intent. Now, if you're expecting me to give you a clean number for the size of the Mongol host, I can't do it honestly. Medieval writers loved huge figures. They also lacked the tools we take for granted. No accurate censuses, no standardized reporting, and plenty of political reasons to exaggerate. Some sources give enormous totals that are difficult to accept at face value. What most modern discussions settle on, carefully with caveats, is that it may have been something like 50 to 60,000 mounted warriors. Even if that estimate is off, even if it was less, you should still feel the weight of it. That is a lot of mobile, experienced cavalry operating far from home. And I want you to think about what that means in practical terms. Horses need fodder, men need water, arrows need resupply. A campaign of months isn't powered by courage alone. It's powered by logistics, by the ability to keep an army alive while it moves through hostile land. So if Kutlug Khwaja really did march south with the intention of forcing one decisive confrontation, it suggests a certain confidence, and it suggests something else too. A willingness to take risk. Because if you march deep and you don't establish a stable base, you are gambling that your opponent will break quickly. That gamble had worked for Mongol armies in many places. It did not always work in India. And this is the moral tension I keep coming back to when I read these accounts. We tend to talk about conquest as if it's a kind of storm, inevitable, impersonal. But conquest is an accumulation of choices. Someone chooses the route. Someone chooses the target. Someone chooses whether to burn a village or bypass it. Someone chooses whether the goal is intimidation, ransom, or permanent control. Those choices are made by people, real people. And the people on the receiving end, farmers, traders, soldiers, children, don't get to vote on the strategy that's about to crush their lives. From Delhi's perspective, the Mongol threat wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a pattern. Pressure on the frontier, reports of riders moving fast through the northwestern corridors, the sense that raids could turn into something larger at any moment. And that brings us back toward the city itself, because here is where the geography and the politics meet. Delhi was not just a rich target, it was a symbol. It was the seat of a sultanate that claimed authority over a wide and diverse region. If Delhi fell, the shockwave would not stop at the gates. Local governors would recalculate loyalties. Rivals would sense weakness. The center could collapse even before the invaders finished the job. So when Kutlug Khwaja's march moves toward Delhi, what he is really moving toward is the heart of a political system. He is betting that one severe blow can break it. And when Delhi prepares to respond, it's not only defending streets and walls, it's defending the idea that the Sultanate can survive the arrival of an enemy with a terrifying reputation. That is the world we're in now. A fractured Mongol order looking for a direction to expand, and an Indian capital that understands very clearly that it may be the next name added to a long list of cities that thought they were too important to fall. Stay with me, because next we need to look at the leadership inside Delhi itself, at the kind of ruler who could meet this threat in the open, and at the kind of general who could win battles and still be pulled into tragedy. Before the Mongols ever reached the outskirts of Delhi, the real battle had already started inside the Sultanate itself. It was a battle over discipline, money, fear, and whether the state could move fast enough to survive a threat that had destroyed stronger kingdoms than this one. Delhi in the late 13th century wasn't a helpless city waiting to be swallowed. It was the center of a large, ambitious realm, and it had learned, through hard experience, that politics and war are inseparable. You can have high walls and brave soldiers, but if your nobles are plotting, if your governors hesitate, if your army exists only on paper, then you're already defeated. At the top of that system stood Alauddin Khalji, and I'm going to be honest with you, he's not the kind of ruler you can put neatly into a heroic frame. The chroniclers don't let you forget how he came to power. He wasn't handed the throne by fate or earned it through some noble tournament. He took it through violence and calculation, and then he held it with suspicion. Alauddin ruled like a man who believed the world was full of knives. Some of those knives were foreign, like the Mongols, but many of them were inside his own court. In a medieval state, that kind of paranoia can be a weakness, but it can also become a kind of strength, because paranoia makes you prepare. And preparation, in this story, matters. One of the most important choices associated with Alauddin is that he didn't want an army that only appeared when nobles felt like showing up. He wanted something closer to a permanent instrument, soldiers who were paid, equipped, and monitored by the state itself. That may sound normal to us, but it wasn't inevitable then. It was expensive, intrusive, and politically dangerous, because it reduced the independence of powerful families. If you're trying to face the Mongols, though, you don't want a loose coalition, you want a machine. So the administration tightened, records became more detailed, inspection became more serious. Two reforms are often named in the sources, and they sound technical, but they tell you what kind of ruler Alauddin was. The dog system involved branding horses, a way to make sure cavalrymen weren't gaming inspections by borrowing good mounts for the day and then returning them afterward. The chera system involved written descriptions of soldiers, another attempt to reduce fraud. Ghost soldiers, fake pay, men counted twice. It's bureaucracy, yes, but it's war bureaucracy, designed to keep the army real. And when I say real, I mean it in the most literal sense. In this kind of conflict, corruption isn't just immoral, it's fatal. If you believe you have 10,000 horsemen and you actually have 6,000, the enemy won't care about your excuses. They'll right straight through the gap. Alauddin's reputation for harsh rule, punishments, spies, strict controls, often dominates the way people talk about him. But you can't separate that harshness from the fact that he was building an apparatus meant to survive an existential threat. He was tightening the state because he believed the state could not afford softness. That's the moral tension, right there. A ruler can be oppressive and still be effective. A ruler can protect a realm and still crush people inside it. History doesn't always offer us the comfort of choosing between a villain and a savior. Sometimes it gives us one man who is both. Now, where this becomes more than policy is at the frontier. Before 1299, the Mongols had already tested Delhi's northwest defenses. There were raids and incursions in the years just before the major confrontation at Kili. They weren't always huge in scale, but they were significant, because they taught both sides something. The Mongols learned what the roads looked like, where fortresses were strong, and how quickly Delhi could respond. Delhi learned something even more important. The Mongols could be stopped. And this is where Zafar Khan enters the story as a real force, not just a name in a chronicle. Later historians portray him as a commander with an aggressive streak, someone who met Mongol forces in the field and didn't blink. There are accounts that credit him with defeating Mongol raiders in the Punjab region and with recapturing the fourth of Sivistan in Sindh after it fell to a Mongol garrison. The exact details vary depending on which source you're reading and how much later it was written, but the broader point holds. Zafar Khan had faced Mongols and won. That mattered more than we sometimes realize, because the Mongols didn't only win with arrows and cavalry maneuvers, they also won with psychological pressure. Their reputation could frighten cities into surrender. It could make armies hesitate, break formation, or simply refuse to fight. A commander who had already beaten them became a problem for that reputation. He turned the Mongols from a myth back into something human. And once an enemy becomes human, the spell begins to break. But if you're a ruler like Dua or a prince like Kutlug Khwaja, that kind of humiliation is dangerous. Not just personally humiliating, politically dangerous. Because resistance spreads. If people hear that the Mongols can be beaten, then more people decide to try. So, by the time the larger invasion force moved towards Delhi, it wasn't just about wealth. It was also about restoring the aura of inevitability, about proving that setbacks on the frontier were temporary, and that the Mongol way of war still worked. On Delhi's side, that meant that Alauddin's reforms were about to be tested in the harshest way possible. It's one thing to brand horses and keep soldier descriptions in a register. It's another to see whether those reforms translate to men holding their ground when the most feared cavalry in Eurasia rides towards them. And this is the part of the story that feels almost modern to me. Not in technology, obviously not, but in the way it shows how states survive. They survive by building systems that function under pressure. They survive when orders still flow, when supplies still arrive, when soldiers still trust that their pay will be there and their comrades will still be beside them. They fail when those systems collapse. If you step back and look at Alauddin and Zafar Khan together, you can see the two sides of defense. Alauddin represents structure, discipline, administration, the cold logic of preparing for a fight you may not be able to avoid. Zafar Khan represents the sharp edge, the man who meets the enemy face to face, who embodies the idea that the Mongols are not invincible. And yet, both of those forces, structure and aggression, can collide. Discipline can be threatened by a bold commander. A bold commander can be undone by the tactics he thinks he understands. And that's what makes this moment so tense. Delhi is stronger than it used to be, but the Mongols are coming anyway. And now the question isn't whether the Sultanate can organize an army. The question is whether the army it built can hold its nerve when the horizon itself seems to move. In the next part of our journey, we're going to follow the Mongol advance as it closes in on Delhi, and we'll watch the city transform, day by day, into a place where every decision feels like a gamble with civilization as the stake. When Kutlug Khwaja finally drove his army south toward Delhi, it didn't look, at least in several medieval accounts, like the kind of Mongol invasion people had learned to expect. In so many other regions, the Mongols arrived like a firestorm. They took cities, stripped villages, and fed their momentum with terror. But on this march, the emphasis is different. Some sources suggest he avoided getting bogged down. Fortresses were bypassed, towns were left behind. Not out of mercy, but out of focus. If your goal is to force one decisive confrontation, you don't spend weeks battering stone walls for a side prize. You keep your horses fresh, you keep your men together, you save your strength for the main target, Delhi. Even if every detail of that restraint is debated, the strategic logic is hard to deny. Kutlug Khwaja wanted the capital. He wanted the heart of resistance. And the closer his host came, the more the north of India began to move, because people move when they sense a disaster rolling toward them. Refugees started arriving in waves, not just with injuries and burned belongings, but with stories, and stories travel faster than armies. Every mile they ran, the Mongols grew larger in the telling. Every night on the road, fear added another layer. A raid became a massacre. A skirmish became an apocalypse. By the time those people reached Delhi's gates, the city was already changing. The streets tightened with newcomers, the markets felt thinner. It's a strange thing, but you don't need an enemy to step inside your walls to feel siege pressure. The mere threat can choke trade routes. Merchants hesitate. Grain becomes harder to find. Prices rise. And when food becomes uncertain, even a well-governed city starts to feel unstable. You would have seen it in small human behaviors, people speaking in lower voices, shopkeepers bringing goods inside earlier than usual, families sleeping with their most valuable objects wrapped in cloth beside them as if they might have to run before dawn. And you would have heard it in the sacred places, temples and mosques filled not only with devotion but with anxiety. When the world shakes, people seek something steady to hold. Then Kutlug Khwaja's army stopped at Kili, just a short distance north of the walls, close enough to make it personal, close enough that at night you could look out and see the glow of their fires, close enough that the city's imagination didn't have to work very hard anymore. And now, Alauddin Khalji faced the kind of choice that defines rulers, sometimes more than any battle does. His advisors, according to the general sense preserved in the sources, urged caution. Negotiate, they argued. Offer tribute if you must. Buy time. Stay behind Delhi's walls and force the Mongols into a siege. Let stone and patience do what blood might not. But that advice wasn't foolish. A city can be a weapon. Walls can neutralize cavalry. A siege strains an army that has marched far and has no secure supply base. Time, if you can control it, can be your ally. But Alauddin didn't only hear military logic in those suggestions. He heard political danger. Because Delhi wasn't just holding off an invader, it was holding together an empire of governors, nobles, and ambitious men who watched the center for signs of strength or weakness. If the Sultan appeared afraid, if he hid, if he paid off the enemy, then the message that traveled across the realm might be worse than the Mongols themselves. The message would be, the center is scared. And in a medieval state, that kind of message is gasoline. It feeds rebellion. It encourages breakaway rulers. It invites the periphery to test the capital's grip. So, Alauddin chose to ride out. It's tempting to paint that as pure courage, but I don't think that's honest. It was courage, yes, but it was also calculation. He understood that he might lose in the field. He understood that he might die, and he still decided that the greater risk was letting the realm unravel from within. What I find striking is that his preparations, as the story is often told, don't sound like the preparations of a man convinced of victory. They sound like the preparations of a man who knows defeat is possible. He arranged for Delhi's defense even if the field army failed. He made plans for surrender under certain conditions, to avoid a long, pointless siege that would punish civilians. He thought about routes of retreat, about what could be salvaged if the worst happened. That isn't romantic heroism. That is grim leadership. Kutlug Khwaja, for his part, applied pressure in a way the Mongols understood very well. Psychological warfare. Some accounts describe messages intended to frame the confrontation as a personal duel of kings, not general against general, sultan against prince, a challenge that forced Alauddin into a public posture of strength. Even if chroniclers shaped the dialogue to sharpen the drama, the method makes sense. If you can corner a ruler to fight on your terms, you've already gained a kind of victory. You've narrowed his options. You've pulled him out of the safety of walls and into the open, where steppe cavalry traditionally excelled. And so, in the last hours before the march, Delhi fell into a heavy, prayerful quiet. You can imagine the night, lamps burning low, armor straps being checked for the third time, horses shifting in stables, steam rising from their nostrils in the cold, soldiers speaking softly to brothers and friends, careful with their words, because there are some thoughts you don't want to say out loud the night before a battle. Families said goodbye. Wives and husbands touched foreheads a moment longer than usual. Parents held their sons' faces a moment longer than usual. Not dramatic scenes, just the simple, brutal awareness that tomorrow might separate people forever. At dawn, the gates opened. The army moved north toward Kili in disciplined formation. Not a panicked surge, not a ceremonial parade. A measured march toward a plain where two systems of war were about to test each other. The Mongol machine of speed and intimidation, and the Delhi Sultanate's hard-built structure of discipline and reform. This is where the story stops being rumor and starts being contact. In the next stage, we step onto that battlefield. We'll see the ground itself, river on one side, forest on the other, and how it shapes the fight. And we'll come to the moment when a single decision, made in the heat of provocation, threatens to tear a careful plan apart. When the army of Delhi reached Kili, the first thing it would have felt was the space. Not endless space. This wasn't the wide-open steppe where Mongol cavalry could sweep around an enemy like water around a rock, but a broad, tense corridor of land, shaped by the terrain itself. On one side ran the Yamuna, a cold presence in winter, with mist rising off the water and reeds bending in the wind. On the other, a line of forest pressed in dark and dense. River and trees narrowed the battlefield, limiting how far either army could spread. And that mattered, because the Mongols loved room, they loved movement, they loved flanks. Alauddin Khalji would have understood that immediately. He had fought the Mongols before, and even if he hadn't, his commanders had. They knew that if you give a Mongol army open space, you invite the full weight of their favorite tactics: fast cavalry, feigned retreats, and sudden encirclement. So when Delhi's forces formed up on that plain, they did it with care. In the center was the royal standard and the Sultan himself, surrounded by men whose job was not glory, but protection. The kind of troops who stand closer than comfort and don't ask questions. In front of that center, a heavy cavalry screen stood ready to absorb the first shock. On the left flank, commanders held their positions with reserves behind them. On the right flank was Zafar Khan, the same aggressive general who had already bloodied Mongol forces on the frontier. And behind the cavalry were the elephants. To a modern listener, elephants can sound like something out of legend, but they were a real part of warfare in parts of Asia, and the Mongols had encountered them before in other contexts. Still, their effect on a battlefield was never trivial. They were massive, they were loud, they smelled of sweat and dust and animal heat. And horses, no matter how trained, didn't always like them. A line of elephants could disrupt cavalry momentum the way a wall disrupts a wave. So the Delhi formation at Kili was meant to be stubborn. It was meant to hold, not to chase, not to scatter, to stay intact long enough for time to do its work. Because time was part of Alauddin's strategy. There are traditions that suggest he hoped to delay a full engagement. Reinforcements, possibly moving in from other parts of the Sultanate, would strengthen his hand if he could buy even a little time. And the Mongols, after a long march, were far from any secure supply base. Horses eat, men eat. An army that lives off the land can only do that if the land cooperates. If villages hide food or flee, if fields are barren in winter, the invader's strength begins to leak away quietly, day by day. So Alauddin waited. And on the other side, Kutlug Khwaja could not afford to wait forever. A Mongol army's greatest advantages, speed, shock, momentum, fade when it is forced to linger in place. If Delhi could stall the campaign, the Mongols might be compelled to retreat without the decisive victory they'd come for. That's why the first movements at Kili were not a full assault. They were probes. Small cavalry groups edged forward. Archers rode in, loosed arrows and wheeled away. The goal wasn't to smash the center immediately. It was to test reactions, to find the nerve endings in Delhi's line and press them until something twitched. And if you've ever watched the disciplined formation under harassment, you know how difficult that is for the men inside it. It isn't the big battle that breaks you first. It's the waiting while you take hits you're not allowed to answer. It's the sound of arrows thudding into shields, the sting of one striking a man beside you, the taunt of riders who seem to dance out of reach. On the Delhi side, soldiers held their positions. Lances stayed level, shields stayed tight. Commands rippled down the line. Hold, hold, hold. But on the right flank, where Zafar Khan watched the probes, the tension was building in a different way. Zafar was not a timid commander. His earlier victories had proven that. He was the kind of leader who met danger with motion, who believed in pressing the enemy, not simply enduring him. And when Mongol skirmishers began to harass his position, riding close, shooting, retreating, repeating, Zafar's men were forced to stand and take it. You can imagine what that felt like. The frustration of watching the enemy ride away untouched. The anger of seeing your own line bleed one arrow at a time. Zafar understood Mongol tactics. He had fought them before. He would have known, at least in theory, that a retreat could be a trap. But theory doesn't always survive contact with emotion. As the harassment continued, something in him began to harden. The sources later portray it as impatience or courage or both. And the critical point is this: he did not ask the Sultan for permission. He attacked. It begins as a signal, a hand raised, a command shouted, a unit surging forward, hooves tearing at the mud, breath bursting out of men and horses as they accelerate. In the center, Alauddin sees the movement and feels the danger before it fully forms, because once a wing breaks formation, the entire plan becomes fragile. If you're holding a line, every piece matters. Pull one out, and the pressure shifts everywhere. Alauddin could not simply rush after Zafar without exposing his own center. He couldn't abandon the royal position. He couldn't open the formation without giving the Mongols what they wanted. But Zafar was already gone, pushing into the open ground. At first, it looks like it's working. The Mongol skirmishers fall back. They ride away. The chase begins. The Delhi cavalry stretches out as faster horses pull ahead and slower ones lag behind. The distance from the main army grows. 100 yards becomes several hundred, then farther. And this is where the Mongol method shows itself. The retreat isn't panic, it's a choreography. The skirmishers are pulling Zafar's men away from support, away from the safety of the larger formation, and into the space where the Mongols can close a ring. And when the trap snaps shut, it does so with the suddenness of a door slamming in the dark. From the forest side, hidden cavalry emerges. From the riverside, more riders appear through low fog. Units converge with practiced timing, and suddenly the pursuers are the ones being hunted. On the right flank, Zafar's men pull reins and try to regroup, but it's already too late. Their formation has stretched. Their momentum has carried them into a pocket of open ground. This is the moment where bravery becomes something different. It stops being the forward motion of a charge and becomes the refusal to collapse. Zafar, realizing what has happened, does what a commander can do when the best option is gone. He tries to turn chaos back into order. He forms his men into a defensive knot, shields outward, spear butts planted, a circle as tight as they can make it, and around them, the Mongol cavalry begins to close. That is where Part 5 ends, on the edge of catastrophe. A careful defensive strategy has been cracked open by one decision, made in anger and confidence, and the desire not to be bled slowly by arrows. In the next part, we're going to stay with Zafar Khan as the encirclement tightens. We'll see what happens when a man who may have made a fatal mistake decides to make the mistake cost his enemy dearly. And we'll follow the consequences of that single impulsive charge all the way back to the center of the battlefield, where Alauddin must decide what to save and what he cannot. When Zafar Khan broke formation, the battle at Kili didn't simply begin, it tilted. On the right flank, Mongol skirmishers kept riding in close, loosing arrows, then slipping away. It was harassment, yes, but it was also a test. They wanted a reaction. They wanted one part of Delhi's line to move when it wasn't supposed to move. Zafar Khan watched it happen, and you can almost feel the pressure building behind his eyes. He wasn't a man who had earned his reputation by waiting patiently. He had beaten Mongol forces before. He had driven them back on the frontier. And now, standing there while arrows chipped away at his men, he made a decision that felt in the moment like courage. He ordered an attack. From the perspective of the men who surged forward with him, it probably felt like release. Hooves tore up the wet ground, armor clinked and shifted with the rhythm of the charge, breath poured out in white bursts in the cold air. Their line became motion, their fear became speed. From the center, Alauddin Khalji saw the movement and understood what it meant. A disciplined plan depends on stillness as much as it depends on action. Once a wing detaches, the whole formation becomes vulnerable. But he couldn't ride after Zafar. He couldn't send the center to fix a problem created far out on the flank without opening his own heart to a Mongol strike. So he watched, stuck between two awful options: abandon 5,000 men or endanger the entire army trying to save them. Out on the plain, the first minutes looked promising. The Mongol unit in front of Zafar gave ground. They turned and rode away. For an instant it looked like fear, but it wasn't fear. It was choreography. This is what made Mongol warfare so difficult to face. The feigned retreat wasn't a trick you couldn't imagine. It was a trick executed with discipline so consistent that it could work even against people who knew it was coming.
The retreat pulled the enemy forward, it stretched their formation, it broke the cohesion that kept them safe, and Zafar, experienced, aggressive, proud, fell into it anyway. The chase lengthened. Faster horses pulled ahead, slower ones lagged. The distance from the main Delhi line grew until the royal standard behind them became a small shape in the haze. The battlefield, which had been narrow between river and forest, suddenly felt open and exposed. Then the trap snapped shut. From the forest side, Mongol cavalry emerged through mist and branches, coming in fast and straight. From the riverside, more riders appeared, silhouettes rising out of low fog. They didn't rush in wildly. They converged with timing, with spacing, with the calm efficiency of men trained to build an encirclement like a carpenter builds a frame. Zafar's men yanked on reins, trying to regroup, but momentum is a kind of chain. You don't simply stop a cavalry pursuit and turn it into a tight defensive line without paying for it. Horses skid only so far before physics takes over. Riders need seconds they don't have, and as the ring tightened, those seconds disappeared. Zafar did what a commander can do when the best options are already gone. He turned chaos into a last stand. He pulled his men into a compact knot, shields outward, spears angled, horses pressed close, a circle, tight enough that it couldn't be easily split, but still breathing, still moving as a single organism. And around that circle, Mongol archers began to work. They didn't have to rush the center of the knot immediately. They could ride the perimeter, loose arrows into gaps, and wait for weakness. In battles like this, it's not always the heroic charge that kills you, it's fatigue. It's the moment your shield arm drops a fraction. It's the horse that stumbles. It's the arrow that finds the space under a helm. Inside the ring, the fighting became short and brutal. There's no room for fancy swordplay when bodies are packed tight. It's shoves, parries, quick cuts, and desperate control of footing in mud that sucks at boots and hooves. And this is where later chroniclers add a powerful scene. Some traditions say Kutlug Khwaja himself rode close and offered Zafar Khan a chance to surrender. In that telling, the Mongol prince respects courage, and he offers reward, rank, survival, even power if Zafar will change sides. We can't prove the exact words. Medieval writers often shaped dialogue to teach lessons about loyalty and honor, but the idea is believable. The Mongols did sometimes incorporate talented enemies. A strong commander was a valuable prize. If that offer was made, Zafar's refusal becomes the moral center of the story, because it's the moment where survival is placed in one hand and loyalty in the other, and Zafar chooses loyalty. Whether he smiled, whether he spoke politely, whether he spat the words out, those are details that change with the storyteller. What matters is that he did not bend. He chose to die as a man of Delhi. Then the fighting resumed, harder. At some point in that crushing chaos, Kutlug Khwaja is reported to have been wounded. The sources don't always agree on the precise moment or even the exact weapon, but the claim appears often enough that we have to take it seriously as a possibility. In the press of close combat, a spear point or a blade could reach even a prince, especially if he rode forward to witness the resistance for himself. If Zafar did strike him, it would be the kind of act that only happens when a doomed man decides to spend his last strength to hurt the enemy's command. We also have to acknowledge the uncertainty. It's possible the wound happened elsewhere amid the broader fighting. It's possible later writers wanted to connect Zafar's sacrifice to the outcome in a clean, satisfying line. History isn't always that tidy. But what is consistent is the next development. The Mongol prince's condition deteriorated. Fever followed, and in the medieval world, fever after a deep wound is not a minor complication. It is often the beginning of the end. Kutlug Khwaja was pulled back toward his own lines, protected by his guards. Attendants pressed cloth, tightened bandages, tried to do what they could with the medicine of the era. The army could protect him from blades, it could not protect him from infection. Out on the plain, Zafar Khan's circle continued to shrink. Men fell, horses collapsed, shields splintered. The knot held as long as a knot of exhausted human beings can hold against an enemy that has numbers and space. From Alauddin's position near the royal standard, the distant dust and fog where Zafar fought must have felt like an open wound in the battle plan. He could see it, but he couldn't reach it. If he broke the center to rescue the right flank, he might lose everything. If he stayed, he sacrificed a man who had fought for him more fiercely than most. This is where the romantic idea of honor runs into the ugly reality of command. Honor might be the refusal to retreat, it might be loyalty to a ruler, it might be obedience to orders, but on a battlefield, those definitions can collide. Zafar's courage in this moment is also disobedience. His last stand is heroic, but it's also the result of a mistake. Alauddin's restraint looks cold, but it may be what keeps the army alive. And that's the tragedy at the center of Part 6. The men who die far out on the flank are not only dying for their city, they're dying because war punishes impatience as brutally as it punishes fear. By the time the dust begins to settle, Zafar Khan's force is effectively destroyed. The Mongols, meanwhile, have suffered losses too, and their prince has been wounded badly enough that it changes what happens next. When you strip the legend away, what you're left with is something almost unbearable in its simplicity: a decision, a trap, a last stand, and a wounded commander. And now the wider battle has to continue without Zafar Khan. In the next part, we're going to shift back to the center, where the Mongols bring their weight against Alauddin's main line. We'll watch elephants and heavy cavalry collide with steppe tactics, and we'll see how in the medieval world, the fate of thousands can turn on something as small and as unstoppable as infection.
By the time Zafar Khan's last stand had been swallowed by haze and distance, the battle at Kili had shifted into its most dangerous phase. The right flank was gone. The careful plan had been cracked open, and now the Mongols turned their full attention toward the center, toward the royal standard, and the man beneath it. This is where the fighting stops looking like skirmishing and starts looking like collision. From the Mongol side, units began to move with that disciplined calm that made their armies so frightening. Not a wild rush, but a coordinated surge, horses gathering speed, riders closing ranks, standards bobbing in the smoke. The sound would have been the first warning: the low thunder of hooves, the creak of leather, the clink of metal, and then the hiss of arrows cutting through the air. On Delhi's side, Alauddin's center tightened. Heavy cavalry formed a screen in front of him, shields aligned, lances angled. Behind them, infantry and archers stood ready, and behind those ranks loomed the elephants, massive bodies waiting like a final argument. When the first contact hit, it wasn't cinematic, it was ugly, it was pressure. Lances struck shields and slid away. Horses collided shoulder to shoulder, trying to push through gaps that weren't there. Mud grabbed at hooves, breath turned to vapor in the cold air. Archers loosed volleys over the mass, arrows arcing into smoke and falling wherever fate and physics brought them down. A shield would catch one with a dull thud. Another would glance off a helm and vanish into the crowd. Every impact was small, but together they created that grinding sense that the battlefield is slowly tightening around you. Then the elephants moved. It's difficult to describe what an elephant does to a battlefield if you've never seen one up close. It isn't just size, it's presence. The ground seems to accept the animal before your mind does. Each step lands with weight you can feel through your feet. Their breath is loud, their smell is unmistakable, and in the chaos of cavalry combat, they introduce something horses cannot ignore. So when Alauddin's elephants pressed forward, they didn't automatically win the battle, but they changed the rhythm of it. They blunted momentum. They broke the clean lines of a mounted charge. They forced Mongol riders to adjust, to circle,
to find angles that weren't immediately there. Meanwhile, the heavy cavalry around the Sultan held their ground. This is the part that matters more than any single heroic stroke. The Mongols were used to seeing enemy formations crack, not always because the enemy lacked courage, but because panic spreads faster than command. Yet here, the center did not collapse. The men around Alauddin stayed in place. They absorbed pressure, they closed gaps, they fought in short, efficient motions without chasing. The sources often mention the death of an important commander near the Sultan's position. Alp Khan is one name that appears in later accounts. Whether we can reconstruct the exact moment or the exact blow is another question, but the idea that the center paid heavily for holding is completely believable. You don't stop a Mongol surge without losing good men. A wall of steel is still made of bodies, and bodies break. As the day wore on, the battle became a test of endurance. On the flanks, Delhi's commanders countered Mongol probing attacks. They didn't pursue too far. They didn't let the line unravel. That kind of restraint is not easy in the middle of violence. It requires discipline, yes, but it also requires a willingness to ignore instinct. When an enemy pulls back, everything in you wants to chase. You want the satisfaction of making them run. But the Mongols built their empire on punishing exactly that impulse. So, Delhi's leaders did what Zafar Khan, for all his courage, did not do in that critical moment. They held. They stayed connected to the center. They protected the shape of the army. Alauddin, in many portrayals, was present in the thick of the fight, not simply watching from behind, but close enough that men could see him and take heart. That detail makes sense, because a ruler who chose to fight in the open would need to be seen. In an age where rumors can unravel an army, the visibility of the leader can be as important as any tactical maneuver. And yet, even with that visibility, you can feel the exhaustion creeping in. Horses pant, men's shoulders burn from holding shield and weapon. The smoke thickens, and your world shrinks to the few feet in front of you. In that kind of fighting, you don't think about the empire, you think about your next breath. As the sun sank lower, both armies began to pull back. Not because either side had achieved a clean victory, but because bodies have limits. Thousands lay dead or wounded. The field between the lines became a space filled with cries that no one could answer. The living gathered what they could and retreated into their camps, where fires burned low and the night air cut through sweat-soaked cloth. This is the part of war that legends skip, the hours after combat, when the adrenaline drains away and all that remains is pain. Men calling for water, men whispering prayers, men staring into flames because if they close their eyes, they'll see the day again. In the Delhi camp, surviving commanders urged Alauddin to retreat behind the walls. Their argument was simple and, again, not foolish. They had lost Zafar Khan. They had lost other key men. They had bled. Why risk another day in the open when stone walls could turn the fight into a siege where the Mongols might weaken? But Alauddin refused to retreat. In some traditions, he is portrayed as saying he would only move forward. Whether those are his exact words or the chronicler's dramatic shaping, the meaning is clear. He believed that retreat would be read as weakness by his own troops, by his rivals, by governors across the realm. In a political world as dangerous as the battlefield, he chose to stand his ground. Across the field, in the Mongol camp, Kutlug Khwaja lay injured. Fever is a quiet enemy. It doesn't announce itself with banners. It doesn't care about rank. And as the night deepened, the Mongol leadership faced its own problem. A prince could not easily be replaced. A wounded commander changed the risk calculation for the entire army. So, the first day ended with both sides exhausted, both sides wounded, and neither side able to claim what it wanted most, a decisive outcome. And that is the tension at the end of Part 7. Delhi has held, but at a cost. The Mongols have not broken the center, but they have not withdrawn yet. The war is not decided by courage alone now. It will be decided by time, by supplies, and whether an army far from home can afford to keep waiting. In the next part, we're going to enter the strange, unsettling days that follow. days when two enormous armies watch each other in near silence, and we'll see how, in medieval warfare, victory can arrive not with a charge, but with a decision made quietly in the dark.
The second day at Kili begins the way the first day ended, with two armies close enough to kill each other, and yet strangely unwilling to commit. In the cold light of morning, the battlefield looks different. Smoke hangs in thin layers over churned ground. The river breathes mist along one flank, and the forest on the other side stands dark and silent like a wall. Between them, men in armor hold their places and watch. You can feel the weight of exhaustion in the way horses keep shifting their feet, and in the way soldiers move like their joints have turned to iron overnight. There are skirmishes, yes, small movements, probing riders, a few arrows loosed as warnings rather than as an attempt to break the line, but there is no great collision, no renewed thunder of the first day. It's as if both sides are listening for something. Alauddin Khalji's patience is not simply stubbornness, it's strategy. If he can delay the decisive fight, time becomes a weapon in his hands. He knows reinforcements are moving toward him from elsewhere in the Sultanate. He also knows what an invading cavalry army needs in order to keep its edge: fodder, food, water, and momentum. Without those, even the most feared riders in the world begin to slow. And the Mongols, for all their speed and discipline, are far from home. They are living off the land in winter. That is never comfortable, and it is often not sustainable. Villages can hide grain, people can flee with their animals, wells can be guarded or emptied, an army can look strong and still be quietly starving. So Alauddin waits, and the stillness itself becomes a kind of pressure. On the Mongol side, Kutlug Khwaja can't simply wait forever either. His entire campaign is built around the idea of decisive shock, a clean victory near Delhi, a collapse of resistance, a march that ends with the gates opening, not a long standstill in hostile territory. But now there is another problem in the Mongol camp, and it's the kind of problem that doesn't care about reputation. Kutlug Khwaja is wounded. The sources don't always agree on exactly how or by whom, but they do converge on the fact that he is injured and that his condition worsens. In the medieval world, that's a terrible sentence. A wound is not just pain, it's risk, infection, fever, weakness that spreads through the body day by day until a commander who can lead a charge can barely sit upright. Inside the Mongol camp, this changes everything. Imagine the scene in a prince's tent. The light is low, the air is cold, even near the lamps. Attendants do what they can with cloth and pressure and crude treatment. A general steps in, whispers to another, glances at the cot, and then looks away. Because to look too long is to admit what everyone is thinking. If the prince dies out here, it's not simply a personal tragedy, it's a political disaster. A prince is not replaceable the way a standard captain is replaceable, and a prince's death on a failed campaign can ripple all the way back to the court that sent him. Meanwhile, the days drag on. The third day is even quieter than the second, and that quiet is unnerving. Two massive armies, so close that scouts can ride the distance in minutes, hold their ground and do almost nothing. Soldiers on both sides feel it in their bodies. The adrenaline has nowhere to go. The fear doesn't get released through action, so it turns inward. It becomes a tightness in the jaw, a trembling in the hands when no one is watching, a restlessness that makes men pace when they should be sleeping. On Alauddin's side, patience begins to look like confidence. The army holds together, the line stays intact. There is no reckless pursuit, no sudden collapse. Whatever else you think of Alauddin as a ruler, his system has produced discipline, and discipline is the one thing the Mongols always try to steal from you. On the Mongol side, time becomes heavier. Supplies are thinning, horses are tired, the local countryside isn't offering enough, and Kutlug Khwaja's fever is not breaking,
it's tightening its grip. His men can ride through 100 miles of hard country, but they can't outrun infection. Somewhere in the Mongol camp, an emergency council forms. You can picture men gathered in a circle, shoulders hunched in the cold, speaking in short, controlled bursts. One voice insists they should press the attack. Another points out the risk. Another doesn't speak much at all, because he knows the truth is already present in the room. If their commander dies here, this campaign may become a stain that can't be scrubbed clean. This is the moment where an army has to admit what it hates admitting, that the enemy has not broken, that the land is not cooperating, that the human body is failing. So, in the dark of night, the Mongols begin to do the one thing their reputation was supposed to make impossible. They withdraw. Not as a rout, not as a panicked flight, as an operation. Tents are folded quietly, ropes are tightened, fires are smothered, horses are mounted and turned north. Units move in controlled columns, disappearing into fog and darkness, with a professionalism that reminds you why they were feared in the first place. Even retreat for a disciplined army can be done with menace. On the Delhi side, the scouts don't understand what's happening at first. In the dimness, the enemy camp looks the same: shadow, smoke, faint glow. But by dawn, the truth is unavoidable. The plain where the Mongol fires had burned is empty. Only trampled ground remains, cold ash, broken stakes, the scars of an army that was there yesterday and is gone today. And in that moment, the reaction in the Delhi camp is almost uncontrollable. Relief pours out of men like breath after being held too long. Some shout, some embrace, some fall to their knees. After days of waiting and one day of brutal combat, the sudden absence of the enemy feels like a miracle. But when word reaches Alauddin, the response, in many tellings, is not celebration. He looks north. He watches the faint dust on the horizon where the Mongols have gone, and he understands something that soldiers celebrating in the sunlight don't always want to hear. A retreat is not a promise. It's a decision made under pressure, and pressure can change. If you're a ruler like Alauddin, you don't survive by believing the danger is over just because you won breathing room. You survive by assuming the danger will return in another shape. So the field at Kili falls quiet, not with a clean ending, but with a pause bought by discipline, by terrain, by logistics, and by the terrible vulnerability of a wounded prince. In the next part, we'll follow what happens after that pause, how victory is claimed, how it is written down, and how the story of this battle becomes contested ground of its own. Because sometimes the fighting doesn't end when the armies separate. Sometimes it continues in ink, in silence, and in the names that power chooses to remember or erase.
When the sun came up after the Mongols slipped away, the battlefield didn't look like victory. It looked like absence. Where there had been rows of fires and the shadowy movement of an enemy camp, there was only trampled ground, cold ash, broken stakes, the shallow scars of thousands of hooves pressed into winter mud. If you walked out there, the air still smelled faintly of smoke, like a room after a candle has burned down. Except this candle had been an army. For the men of Delhi, that emptiness was almost impossible to process at first. In war, your mind learns to measure danger by what it can see: a line of riders, a banner, a wall of tents. When those things vanish overnight, you don't instantly feel safe. You feel disoriented. You wonder if the enemy is simply waiting in the fog for you to make a mistake. But then the news spreads, and it spreads fast. They're gone. And what follows is the kind of relief that hits like dizziness. Soldiers embrace. Some laugh in disbelief. Others sit down hard as if their legs only now remembered they're allowed to give out. It's not the clean joy of a parade. It's a release of pressure so intense it becomes physical. If you've ever held your breath without realizing it, you know the sensation. That moment you finally exhale and your body feels lighter. That's what this would have been for the defenders, except magnified across an entire army that had spent days staring at its own possible extinction. And yet, in the accounts that survive, Alauddin Khalji doesn't appear as a man swept up by the celebration. He looks north, toward the fading dust of retreat, and he seems to understand what his soldiers, in the first rush of relief, don't want to hear. A retreat is not a surrender. It's a choice made under pressure, and pressure changes. Alauddin had one breathing room, not peace. He had stopped the immediate crisis at Kili, but he had not removed the Mongol threat from the world. If anything, he had proven something dangerous, that Delhi would fight, and that fighting Delhi would cost blood. From there, the story moves from battlefield to city, and the mood shifts again. When the army returns toward Delhi, it isn't marching through a countryside that feels untouched. The roads are crowded, the gates are tense. The city is still bruised by fear, even as people try to convince themselves the nightmare is over. You can picture the scene inside the walls, townspeople gathering at the roadside, searching faces for husbands, sons, brothers. The armor is dirtied, horses are tired, men are thinner after days of strain and short rations. Some come home, some don't, and for the ones who don't, there is no grand explanation that makes absence easier. This is where victories reveal their hidden costs, and it's also where power reveals something else. The battle doesn't end when the enemy leads. It continues in the story that gets told afterward. Because in the aftermath of Kili, Zafar Khan becomes a problem. Not on the battlefield anymore, he's gone, but in memory. Later traditions portray him as the commander who broke formation, charged without permission, and died in a doomed stand. If you're Alauddin, trying to build an army that depends on discipline, that disobedience cannot become a celebrated example. You cannot teach an army to hold the line against the Mongols and then praise the man who ignored the line. At the same time, Zafar Khan's courage is impossible to deny. The fact that his stand became so vivid in later writing tells you that people remembered it, even if official records didn't always want to. And this is where we have to talk about the sources the way they really are. Medieval chronicles are not neutral. They're politics in ink. They're written in courts, under patrons, within systems of reward and punishment. A court historian is not simply recording events. He is also protecting his position, his life, and the legitimacy of the ruler who pays him. One of the most famous literary figures associated with Alauddin's court is Amir Khusro. His works are brilliant, and they are valuable, but they also reflect a courtly perspective, one that naturally centers the Sultan. Other writers, especially writing later or at a distance, preserve different emphasis. So it's not surprising that some accounts play down Zafar Khan, or omit him, or reduce the episode to a brief, controlled note. Later chroniclers, like Isami in the 13th century, are often credited with preserving more of the dramatic version of Zafar's last stand. Whether every detail is literal truth is hard to prove, but the broader pattern is telling. Memory survives where official narrative hesitates. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it forces an uncomfortable question. What is victory if the people who paid for it are erased? Zafar Khan may have made a grave tactical mistake, but if his actions contributed to the Mongols' difficulties, especially if the injury to Kutlug Khwaja is connected to his stand, then the line between disobedience and sacrifice becomes painfully thin. An army needs discipline. A city sometimes survives because someone breaks discipline at exactly the wrong time and then refuses to run. History doesn't always reward that kind of contradiction with a neat moral. Meanwhile, the Mongol side is also dealing with consequences. Kutlug Khwaja's injury and fever, whatever the exact origin, becomes part of why retreat becomes thinkable. Medieval medicine could bandage and cauterize, but it could not reliably stop infection. A prince could command thousands and still lose a battle against his own wound. From the perspective of his father's realm, the retreat is not merely a tactical choice. It is a message. It says that India is not an easy extension of Mongol power. It says that Delhi cannot be brushed aside like so many other targets had been. And that message matters because reputation is one of the Mongols' greatest weapons. The moment enemies believe you can be resisted, you begin to lose victories you used to win without fighting. Now, Kili does not end the Mongol threat entirely. It's important not to turn this into a fairy tale ending. Mongol pressure returns in later years. A major moment comes in 1303, when Mongol forces reach Delhi again, and the city endures a long siege. The sources describe hardship, tight supplies, fear, and the grinding patience required to outlast an enemy that cannot easily sustain itself far from home. And over the following years, further clashes, often dated in 1305 and 1306, show Delhi's armies becoming more effective at punishing incursions. The pattern that emerges is not that the Mongols suddenly became weak, but that the cost-to-benefit ratio of conquering Delhi began to look worse and worse. So, Part 9 ends with a victory that doesn't feel like celebration for long. It ends with an empire that has survived a near disaster, and the ruler who understands survival demands control over armies, over governors, and even over the story people tell about what happened. In the next part, I want to step back and look at what Kili really left behind. Three central figures, Alauddin Khalji, Zafar Khan, and Kutlug Khwaja, and one hard, lingering question. If honor can mean obedience, and it can mean defiance, then what did it mean on that winter plain north of Delhi?